What better way than to close it with the sounds from the streets, Santana.
The original inspiration was the deluge of media hype that I was reading and being affected by 10,000 miles away in Switzerland in 2007, the 40th anniversary of the so-called Summer of Love. I started seeing this appear at the beginning of 2007. And as I said, it really was a deluge. By the middle of the year, it was evident that something that I really thought, you know, might be confined to California or the West Coast or something like that was obviously of significant interest in Europe. And I started to pay more attention to what was occurring in the media. And when I, you know, started to actually, you might say, get outraged by the myth-making and the hype and the hoopla and the way the whole story was being constructed, it was because it was not just journalistic in the simple sense of disposable news, but it was actually being written as if this was history, when in fact the terms like hippie, flower power, acid rock, Summer of Love itself, were actually all media concoctions and had no real relationship to the events that had taken place, other than to mischaracterize them or to distort them at the time. That's how I got started on the project. I don't think I originally thought of it so much of as a book as like an essay or an article, but the farther I dug into the subject and began reading books, looking at documentary films, the more it became apparent that there was a peculiar division between histories that were written about the events, political organizations, movements, anti-war movement, the Black Panther Party, the farm workers, and so on. They were over here on one side and more or less only made passing reference to the music of the time or, you know, particular groups that might have made a political song or something like that. And on the other side, there was musicological, cultural studies, cultural theory, and above all, rock journalism, rock criticism, which had actually been born at the time in the 60s. That was talking about the music and the groups and the, you know, famous musicians that had come out of San Francisco in the period, and very little reference to what was happening politically. So you had a very strange, you know, two tracks running parallel, as if two different worlds were being occupied or developed at that time in that place. And of course the music books would make reference to the Vietnam War, or they'd make reference to the turbulent times, or they'd make reference to the occasional political lyric or you know, radical song or revolutionary this or revolutionary that, but it would not be any kind of thorough analysis of what was actually a very close interaction. And it was not, of course, confined to music, because there was theater, street theater, the murals, the famous mural arts, and the posters and things like that that also emerged at the same time in the same place. But music was definitely the, you might say, the preeminent of all the arts, and it was clear that a distinction was being made that really didn't correspond to historical reality. The fact is that both from my own experience and from the you know, the historical record that I was able to begin unearthing, there was an interpenetration between music and art in general and politics that simply had to be accounted for, and that's what eventually led to writing the book. Yes, there are two aspects to that question. One is the burial, and one is what happened. I'll start with what happened and then talk a little bit about the burial of it. I think that for a number of historical reasons, as well as some geographical ones, San Francisco occupied a very special place in the United States. The emergence of modern dance and the labor movement in San Francisco, and a particularly radical expression of that, was actually part of the beginning of the 20th century. The fact that San Francisco was not New York and not Los Angeles, centers of, you might say, the culture industry, or certainly publishing, recording, film, all the other industrial aspects, and also the fine arts and so on, that maintained rigid hierarchies. And San Francisco in some ways was free of that. It was less influenced by those structures. And as a result, that combined with the, you might say, the radical dimensions of the labor movement itself. For example, in the 1934 general strike, which in fact made the reputation of San Francisco as a union town, it was not just a union town. It was actually a union, the ILWU, the Longshoremen Warehousemen's Union, led by their incorruptible leader Harry Bridges, that welcomed black people into their ranks. They were among the few unions in the United States that were not systematically discriminatory. They not only welcomed them into their ranks, but into their leadership. They made Paul Robeson an honorary member and so forth. And this is just one indication, and there were many others actually, of the social atmosphere, the ambience within a port city, into which the most innovative and experimental artists could come and find a home. And so at the same time as the labor movement is militant and anti-capitalist, you might say, deliberately, radical certainly, if not revolutionary, you have artists like Henry Cowell, who was an innovative musician and composer. You have the development of the relationship between modern dance and other composers like John Cage and Lou Harrison and people like this, all mingling together in a city that was not being defined or controlled or structured quite the ways that New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles were. So this is part of the background that set the stage for what would happen in the mid-60s. And in fact, it's important to remember that the distance in time between 1934 and 1965 is much shorter than the time between 1965 and 2017. So you're talking about people being alive and active who are actually active in the pre-World War II era, both artistically and politically, and their influence being undiminished in the one city in the United States that was really capable of resisting the McCarthy era that followed World War II. In fact, it was the famous HUAC demonstration on the steps of City Hall where young people, mainly students, simply rejected the House Un-American Activities Committee and really announced the end of the McCarthy era in the one city that had refused to submit. So these are all among the conditions that actually led to what would ultimately be a musical renaissance or an artistic renaissance and social revolution between 1965 and 1975. As far as the burial part, the part that you're referring to, I think that's a subject in itself. On the one hand, there's no doubt that the burial, you might say, began at the beginning. They were already attempts to co-opt, to divert, to suppress, all the way back in 1965. In fact, it was the battle against those forces, the commercial forces of co-optation and the repressive forces of the government, that actually led to some of the most innovative work, including the San Francisco Mime Troops and some of the events that were pioneering efforts, from the Family Dog to the actual mime troop appeals that took place in 1965 and thereafter to raise money for the defense of the mime troop. So at that time, however, the balance of forces was in favor of the revolution. And you could say that even though there were attempts to bury it, which include the naming, the pejorative hippie, as opposed to what we called ourselves, freaks and heads, the attempt to, make a portrayal of the counterculture or the opposition of young people into some, vague, vacuous protest with flowers and all this other symbolism, which in no way characterized what was actually happening, because it was an attempt on the part of a generation to change the world. It was an attempt very consciously to change the way the parents and the authority figures of all kinds, whether they were governmental or religious or educational or military or whatever, were dominating people's lives and subjecting them to all forms of repression, whether they were cultural, psychological, spiritual, or outright governmental. But in terms of the real burial, that what I'm trying to unearth with my study, that really started to take place on a massive scale after the 60s. And for a number of years, it was really unsuccessful. And indeed, I would, what is now popularly known as the culture wars that were waged by the right-wing, forces within society, led by, of course, Ronald Reagan and others of his ilk. Those cultural wars actually went on through the 80s. I mean, they did not succeed in completely really reversing the trends that had been unleashed by the 60s until, really well into the 80s. In fact, there were many people, and I say this in the book, who refused to accept the defeat that actually did take place. And for a long time, there particularly in San Francisco, were a lot of the most radical groups. And when I say San Francisco, I mean the Bay Area. I don't want to get into a geographical battle between Berkeley and San Francisco, because this is a relatively small geographical area, and everybody influenced everybody else. And certainly Oakland was involved with that, as was the South Bay. In any case, the real point is that because radicalism, revolutionary ideas, organizations, movements, and whatever carried on perhaps longer in the Bay Area than they did elsewhere in the country, it was actually difficult for people to accept. I mean, I know I was still here. I was still active in political activity and musical activity. I was part of the Commotion International, which was an artist collective that began in '86 and continued until '97. And it was not easy for people to get their heads around the fact that the the 60s were really over. And that's a complicated discussion in and of itself, and there's a whole chapter devoted to counter-revolution and defeat. But I think that it's important to recognize that the revolution rose to a certain level and had a certain force, social force, artistic force, political force, and then was, in fact, stopped. And, there are different aspects of that, including the reforms that were, made by the government to placate popular opinion, to separate revolutionaries from reformists. That includes Roe v. Wade and the granting of abortion rights and so on. It includes the Environmental Protection Agency. It includes the amendment to the Constitution that made the right to vote 18 instead of 21 because of the great outrage that people felt about young men being drafted to go fight and die but not being able to vote, things like that. And there were many. There's a whole list of things that were done in response to popular movements that you could say were reforms, and they were designed to placate the demands of millions of people. At the same time, there was direct and now well-documented repression of the most revolutionary elements, whether it's the Black Panther Party or the American Indian Movement or the New Communist Movement, in particular the Revolutionary Union and later the RCP, meaning governmental surveillance, infiltration, outright murders, outright ruining of lives by the government. This, again, is quite well documented. What is less documented, and what I try to go into in the book, is the outright suppression of musicians, and believe it or not, this was new to me. I mean, in other words, I didn't go into the book knowing all this stuff like some insider. I actually accepted a lot of the views that were common. I would say they're still common, that, you know, essentially the system bought off musicians. That's why they stopped doing revolutionary stuff. You know, they were essentially co-opted, and that, you know, the music industry was resilient and was able to you know, adapt to the changing musical landscape, and ultimately bring back into the fold all of these wild elements that had broken out between 1965 and you know, 1975. And while there is an element of truth in that, there's no doubt that co-optation was a major influence. The other side of it is that there was massive and systematic suppression of musicians, including a lot of people who didn't even know they were being suppressed. I cite, for example, a doctoral thesis by a young man named Daniel Simmons, who published his doctoral thesis in 2013, where he describes in great detail how not only the FBI at the federal level, but also local vice squads, regional police forces would go after musicians, whether it was for a deliberate political act such as performing at a demonstration or supporting a political cause, or whether it was because these police viewed them as a threat for cultural reasons, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. I mean, there are many different facets to this, but it was widespread and systematic. And again, you have to read the book for all the details. I don't want to bore you with a bunch of facts at the moment, but what emerges from the picture is that you have this combination of the system on the one hand regrouping to disassociate the revolutionary elements from the great mass of people who were protesting and demonstrating against the symptoms of the system, and that's one. And on the other side you have real repression of particularly revolutionary forces, leading to people's incarceration and death and so on. A lot of people are still in prison. Leonard Peltier, Mumia, other people are still in prison for the roles that they played in the 60s. I think there's no doubt. I mean, whatever remains of San Francisco or the Bay Area in the 60s, Oakland, Berkeley included, whatever, has to be smashed. And, you know, I mean, there are numerous reasons for this, which, again, going back to the subject matter in the book, it's often forgotten that in the 60s, the Oakland Army base was the largest in the world. And that's where the troops and the materiel were being shipped to Vietnam, in and out. So there was no way the government was going to ignore the Bay Area. That's one thing. The same could be said today with Silicon Valley and the role of computers in maintaining the system. And I'm not talking about the technology, I'm talking about the business. I'm talking about the fact that, you know, this is one of the few profit generators in terms of industrial manufacture, and the way that this has, you know, been used is not only in the sense of, you know, providing more money and power to the United States or to the ruling elites in this country, but it's also in the co-optive sense that people like Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak and the whole Silicon Valley crowd has tried to co-opt the counterculture and say, we are the real revolution. We're the victory of the revolution. I mean, you even have people like Stuart Brand, who was, you know, in very much in the thick of things in the 60s, saying things like that, you know, and so it's very important to the system to make absolutely sure that the complete erasure of what happened in the 60s, and for that matter what happened in the 20th century, you know, they're trying to obliterate what made this area an important place. Going back to Isadora Duncan, going back to Tom Mooney, going back to the ILWU, going back to the labor movement and, you know, the student unrest that led to the free speech movement and so on. They want to obliterate that, and they want to replace it with Facebook and Google and an image of, you know, coolness or hipness that's associated with possessive individualism and outright, you know, theft. And by theft, I mean the theft of ideas, I mean the theft of ideals, I mean the theft of everything that made the place attractive in the first place to people who have, with vision and with a social conscience. Obviously, one of the most important elements, not only historically, but in terms of my own thesis, and actually I was, to give credit where it's due, I was enlightened by a book by Kenyan dramatist and novelist Ngugi wa Thiong'o. He wrote a book in 1998 called Pen Points, Gun Points, and Dreams, where he theorizes arts rivalry with the state. Arts rivalry with the state. And what that entails is a number of items, but the key is the battle over performance space. And of course, when I read the book, I was in the middle of my research, and this was exactly what happened in San Francisco. And it happened precisely with the San Francisco Mime Troupe taking its radical theater into the city parks, making a real impact socially with radical theater. In fact, an innovative form for the time. And at the same time challenging the city's authority and to issue permits and so on, and getting arrested. Ron Davis was arrested in 1965, and their business manager, Bill Graham, organizes an appeal to raise money for the defense, and this sets off a whole chain of events that ultimately lead to the musical renaissance, social revolution, and so on. And why this is significant obviously transcends the time and place. This is something that's going to be fought out over and over again until we get rid of this system. In other words, this is always how the control of ideas is actually maintained. It's not simply by censorship. There is censorship and there was suppression in a, you might say the classic sense of, you can't sing that song, boy, because we're not going to put it out. I mean, there were things like that happening all the time. Or save it for your solo album, this kind of stuff. But the real battle was not specifically over a lyric or a script to a play. The real battle was over getting it heard. And this is the great duplicity of the whole American game. Freedom of speech, yeah, as long as nobody hears you. And that's what it's all about. It's always been about maintaining this illusion of freedom of speech while the terrible Soviet Union is suppressing Shostakovich, but we let musicians do whatever they want. Not true. Never true. It was never true. You can do what you want in your bedroom, but as soon as you try to go out and play on a public stage, you're going to confront all of the authorities' mechanisms. And that includes noise ordinances, that includes age restrictions, that includes particularly in the case of popular music, the limitations on how long a song can be, how it fits in a radio format. And of course, in the context of the United States, this is not simply a matter of form in terms of what music should sound like or something. This is a question of white supremacy. This is the way the whole system was built, by the exploitation of particularly black culture, black music, going all the way back to the 19th century, and the use of that in the form of minstrelsy and these degrading images of black people to sell the music industry's product. And this was perpetuated systematically throughout the 20th century, and it came up against the realities of the civil rights movement, the black liberation struggle in the 60s. And that's what began to change it. It was not because the music industry suddenly got a conscience and decided that their mountains of millions and billions of dollars somehow had to be accounted for, since most of it actually derived from the music that the people themselves made, black and white, or of all ethnicities, but particularly the vicious exploitation of black musicians and black music. So this needed to be confronted, all right, and it was confronted. That's what made the 60s happen. But that's also been systematically erased. That's also been put back in its box. So we have both sides in this context. And again, the question that you're asking about performance space, the relationship of art making of any kind, mind you, this is not confined to performance or performance art necessarily, but certainly in the arts that come before a public in a live context, you're going to be fighting over, as I said, noise ordinance, rent, where you allowed to perform, and so forth. And that's going to, bring those challenges on the part of the artists themselves and the audiences are what will bring about, hopefully bring about another renaissance in the future.